What is October 7th? And what is this whole Palestine-Israel conflict?
70% of the population in Gaza are refugees. And every day they go to the fence and they would see their lands, their homes and lands beyond this fence. And these lands belong to the Palestinians. It belonged to the Palestinians.
Please someone stop this. Please someone end this. Please.
Welcome to Internal Files, and today, let's talk about Israel. We hear US politicians speak highly of Israel, people like Joe Biden. To understand this whole situation, let's start at the very beginning, before Israel was even established. We will talk about the start of the Zionist movement, the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the establishment of Israel, and where we are today. Let's start off with Zionism. In the late 1800s, a group of very wealthy, influential European Jews wanted a Jewish homeland, preferably in Jerusalem. This movement was called Zionism, and one of the most prominent figures was Theodor Herzl. This led to the creation of the World Zionist Congress. Funny enough, many of these Zionist European Jews were actually atheists, including Herzl himself. Yeah, it's kind of odd. So Zionism is predominantly a political movement and less so a religious one. As these wealthy European Zionists met, discussing what lands to colonize, where to call their home, the British government initially suggested Uganda, also known as the Uganda Scheme. However, European settlers in Uganda protested this project out of fear that they would be displaced themselves. Kind of ironic if you think about it. And technically the Zionists wanted Jerusalem, so that whole idea was voted down. Other options included Argentina, the Al Arish in the Sinai Desert in Egypt. But again, those fell through and the Zionists continued their search. At one point, these wealthy Zionists offered to purchase Palestine, including Jerusalem, from the struggling Ottoman Empire. However, Sultan Abdul Hamid II refused to sell. He said, Jerusalem, or Al-Quds, is not for me to sell. So the Zionists had to re-strategize. In terms of Zionism in Jerusalem, some Jewish extremists saw this as an opportunity to return to the Promised Land, or the Holy Land. This would set in motion the building of the Third Temple. What's that, you ask? Well, let's talk about this. Solomon's Temple, which essentially would have been deemed the first temple, was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BCE, while the Second Temple was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So now the hypothetical Third Temple would be built as a place of worship and to fulfill certain sacrifices. More on that later. And believe it or not, as it pertains to Zionism and a Jewish homeland in Palestine, the majority of the world's Jewish population actually opposed Zionism. They actually wanted to stay where they were. And many religious Jewish groups stated that according to Judaism and Jewish scholarship, they could not even return to the Promised Land, the Holy Land, until the arrival of the Messiah. On the other hand, according to Christianity and biblical prophecy, Jews returning to the Holy Land would also bring about the end of times. Some even theorize that's why the British Prime Minister, David Lloyd George, who was a Christian zealot, even allowed the signing of the Balfour Declaration. What's that? Well, more on that later. The main issue for Zionists at this point was the Promised Land kind of already had inhabitants on it. You know, the Palestinians, almost 1 million of them. And the Temple Mount had Al-Aqsa compound, including the Dome of the Rock, which is the third holiest site in Islam. But more on that later. Back to our story. Enter World War I and the fall of the Ottoman Empire. The British and Russia, along with France and Italy, rivaled Germany, Austro-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. During this time, a key controversial agreement took place in 1917, the Balfour Declaration. The British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, promised the Zionists and the Rothschilds a Jewish homeland in Palestine, under the condition it would be without trespassing over the civil and religious rights of the non-Jewish communities that already lived there, and without impacting the rights or political status of Jews in any other country. And remarkably, this was only voted on in the British cabinet, with only a few members voting. Not very democratic, may I add. Yet, only one cabinet member rejected this whole thing. He rejected a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And that cabinet member was the only Jewish cabinet member, Edwin Samuel Montagu. He stated, "We do not have enemies anywhere in that region," aka the Middle East. Jews were living peacefully there and prospering. And this project, this Zionist project, will only create animosity towards Jews. And it will only allow the anti-Semitic European nations to kick out their Jewish populations now that they have a Jewish homeland elsewhere. He even reiterated that Jews cannot go back to the Holy Land or the Promised Land until the arrival of the Messiah, and that the British government was not the Messiah. And the other cabinet members just looked at him and said, "Oh, bloody hell, consider it done." So now, our topic at hand, the Zionists and Israel. When World War I ended, the Zionists came to the British and said,
"Well, excuse me."
Maybe not in those exact terms. Essentially, they said, "Hey, you promised us Palestine. We're supposed to get a Jewish homeland in Palestine. We're here to reclaim the kingdom of Judea."
You promised.
Meanwhile, the British were like,
"Oh boy, we like sort of promised the Arabs independence, including Palestinians.
and we sort of promised you Zionists, a homeland in Palestine. So we will create the mandate of Palestine to receive independence in the future. Possibly. And we will allow European Zionists to migrate in mass migrations unrestricted to Palestine from all over the world. What could possibly go wrong, right? Well, in good old British fashion, everything went wrong. First of all, the population demographics. The population of Palestine started off approximately 85% Muslim, 14% Christian, and under 1% Jewish. In the decades to come, mass migration of European Jews from all over the world, mainly Europe, all the way to Palestine, whereby decades later, by 1947, the Jewish population skyrocketed all the way to almost 45%. Whoa, that's a lot. Furthermore, there were over 65,000 members of Zionist Jewish militias. Underground militias, also known back then as terrorist groups. These include the Haganah or Hajana and the Irgun gang. They were organizing, they were arming themselves, and they were committing violence and terrorist attacks on British and Palestinians, culminating with the 1946 King David Hotel bombings, which mainly targeted British personnel, but also saw Palestinian and Jewish victims. Eventually, the British just had enough. They said, "That's it. We don't care that much about Palestine." And they went to the newly formed UN and said, "Hey, buddy, your problem now. Fix it." Long story short, the UN was like,
"Oh boy, we don't have time to take any logical, in-depth analysis approach."
They just looked at the facts and said, okay, so the Jewish population was now 45% of the Palestinian population, and they only owned 10% of the land, but the Palestinians made up 55% of the population, and they owned approximately 90% of the land. So naturally, what we should do as the UN is give the Jewish minority 55% of the land and give the Palestinian majority 45% of the land. Wait, what? That doesn't even make mathematical sense. The math ain't mathing. Anyways, that was the 1947 partition. The Zionist terrorist militias later became the IDF military, and they committed dozens of massacres across Palestine, resulting in what is known as the 1948 Nakba, the catastrophe, whereby hundreds of villages were leveled to the ground, thousands of Palestinians were genocided, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed, displaced from their homes. And that was the creation of the state of Israel.